Welcome to In Focus, brought to you from the Up North Media Center. I'm your host, Kimberli Bindschatel. With me is my co-host, Anthony Weber. And Anthony and I and the whole team decided to change things up a little bit once again, and we're adding another co-host, regular panelist. What should we call you? This is Brandon Everest. He's going to be a more regular face on the show. He's from NMC. He's a sociology professor over there. He's also a social worker. And relevant to the topic tonight, he's also on the steering committee of the Poverty Reduction Initiative. So welcome, Brandon, to the show as a regular guest.
It's nice to be back.
Tonight we're going to talk about caring for those in poverty, and our special expert guest to the conversation next to me is Mary Marois. Mary is the former director of the Grand Traverse Leelanau Department of Health and Human Services. She's also a consultant, travels around the country to talk to communities about people in poverty. Thanks for joining us, Mary.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Great. Now, Mary, caring for people in poverty, can you kind of start us out with why should we even care about that?
Well, let me begin by saying that, we have more people in poverty today than we've had in the last 52 years. We've had an economic upturn, people are going back to work, but the number of people in poverty continues to rise. Part of it is because of income insufficiency, part of it is lack of education, most of it is because of situational poverty. Either people have gotten a divorce or death of a spouse or loss of all of their assets once they've lost a job and they've used up all their assets. But that number just keeps climbing and climbing and climbing, and it continues to climb within our own community here.
Do you think there's an underlying cause in the culture then? I mean, you just listed specific reasons, right? And I'm sure you can point to them as someone who's an expert in this field, but is there an underlying cultural something that's going on? And maybe Brandon, you can jump in on that too.
Well, I think it's probably more economic than cultural. We've made a move over the last 30 to 40 years away from a manufacturing style economy, where a greater percentage of jobs were in that sector, to a more service-driven economy. And in the service economy, you basically have two tiers. Those which tend to be much more highly paid, that are giving some kind of a specialized knowledge service of some kind. Everything from nursing to being a college professor. But at the other end are sort of all the other services that we tend to think of when we think service economy. In our area, being a hospitality-driven economy, we're thinking about servers. We're thinking about those who are sort of providing to tourists who are coming to the area. And what's happening, I think, driving a lot of this, are the returns that are going to those different sectors. Progressively less to those folks who are in the lower tier of the service economy, and progressively more to those who are at the upper, in that knowledge is part of the service economy. Those returns to education over the last 30 years really do explain a lot of the current income distribution that's taking place.
And out of the top 4 jobs in the state of Michigan, only nursing is one where you can make a wage that's above poverty level.
Yeah.
Wow. So is that suggesting then that this service culture that we see around here in Traverse City for sure, but growing elsewhere, is this an unsustainable type of growth? Does it have to be corrected in some fashion to go back to industry, or I forget what the term was you used?
Well, to some degree, I think it's in the eye of the beholder, but I would say that it's unsustainable. One of the things that we know is that economies work best when there's a robust middle class who has enough discretionary income to be able to purchase. 2/3 to 3/4 of our economy is driven by consumption. If people don't have money to buy, what is that going to mean for the long term of the economy? And I think we kind of know the answer to that. Is it long-term sustainable? Certainly not. And also we know that that can drive other kinds of things that could change the culture. How motivated are people going to be to work hard, a central value of American society, when the rewards aren't there? How motivating is that to people? I would say over time it's going to become less and less so. And I think those are 2 reasons to think that we need to be making a change, certainly sooner than later.
Did you say earlier that it had something to do with the education, meaning that you've invested in a college education? I just want to make sure I understood you correctly.
Well,
and that's directly related to the ends of the spectrum.
Go ahead, Mary.
Well, the service.
I was just going to say, we're due for minimum wage increase. I think the 1st of January is going to, I believe it's $5.90, $5.80, $5.90 an hour. Even with that, $8.50, not, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Even with that raise in the minimum wage, if you were a family of 4 and you were working full-time, 20, 80 hours a year, you would still be living in poverty. You know, it's so economic, it is so related to wages and jobs.
Well, what do you say to people that say minimum wage jobs were never intended for that type of worker, that they were intended for high school kids to, you know, they're bagging groceries after they get out of school for money to buy a car or go out on the weekend?
There aren't enough kids to take the minimum wage jobs. And you have to start someplace. Many, all of us, going back to our own histories, we started someplace. Some people were in their 20s and 30s when they started going out into the workforce for the first time. Many moms who stayed home and raised their kids, but now they're out in the workforce and they're starting at the bottom rung. It's not working. Let's look at our own community, Grand Traverse County. We have about 88,000 people living in this county, and I think there are a large number of people out there who think that there's a huge population who are living on welfare. It absolutely is not true. We have about 126 people in Grand Traverse County who are receiving what people consider to be traditional welfare. That's money payments. But we have about 9,000 people in Grand Traverse County who are living at or below poverty, and they are working. They are employed. Those people getting cash assistance, they're getting about $400 a month from the state of Michigan for assistance. They're not living on that. They're barely making it. If they go to work, they're off of that. They don't get any more help.
It's certainly not money that's disincentivizing them from work.
Absolutely.
Do you think this is connected at all with, and my understanding is there's this shifting reality that people are increasingly shifting fields of work every 4 to 5 years, I think I heard is an average anymore, where a number of years ago, and I'm not a historian so I don't want to speculate too directly, you would have someone get out of college and they might work the same job for the rest of their life, and there's things that accrue, whether it's salary or benefits. Now you have a very mobile workforce. Is that contributing to this, or is that maybe something that's hard to quantify?
I guess I'm not exactly sure about how to quantify that. On the one hand, you could see that moving could potentially limit the trajectory of people, but generally people, when they move, one would hope, are moving in an advantageous way for themselves. I think this is largely a cultural thing too. The days of the sort of work your career, retire with the gold watch and get the pension, the sort of golden parachute and golden handcuffs of the previous generation aren't really with us anymore. So worker loyalty has changed. People see themselves as being much more free agents really today in the workplace. And so they're selecting hopefully more often in an advantageous way to move, but also jobs are shifting. Where those jobs are is shifting. So people have to be transient, movable with that too.
And what I'm finding with the population of people in poverty, they're literally going from one minimum wage job to another minimum wage job. They're not moving up the ladder for mobility. They work at a job, it's a part-time job in the summertime, and then they have to move on to something else in the wintertime. They're not building up pension credits, you're not building up an IRA or a 401k. The people that you're talking about we've kind of expected that in the culture. I worked for the state of Michigan for 39 years. That's not happening anymore. People are moving like you are, but it's not people that are in poverty.
So this lateral movement in low-wage jobs, does this seem to be influenced a lot by kind of a systemic cultural barrier that's in place? Or is it maybe a lack of education or skill or experience that allows them to move up? Or maybe it's both. Is there any type of trend that you see in what's fueling that?
I want to add to that, I'm speculating that perhaps because of what we were just talking about, the mobility and that, and we're not investing in a company for our own pension anymore, that maybe the opposite is true, that now these employers aren't willing to invest in the employees. It seems like 50 years ago or whatever, the employer had the lowest level employee invested in helping them to go to the next level because that person was going to be there. It was a good investment. I'm sure that's a factor as well.
You know, I've got a really good example of that, not in this community, but in another, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But I think it is education and training. We know that education and training is a key to getting out of poverty. We know that. But how you get people there, for example, the department that I worked at doesn't support people if they are receiving assistance and then want to go to school. They won't support them in terms of childcare, and they don't support them in terms of any kind of cash assistance. So we're sending people a double message. Yes, education and training is important, but no, we won't support you while you're getting it. In Grand Rapids, there was an organization called a Butterball. They didn't make the turkeys. I think they sold that a long time ago, but they did the little turkey butter patties. And the guy who was the CEO of this organization, really invested in his employees. In fact, he would reward his human services person with pay raises every single time one of his employees was able to buy a house. And they paid a good wage. They were the starting wage, but they had other organizations that were a part of their system where people could move up and get more pay. Their policy, or their, I try to think, mission statement was enhance lives. This is the kind of employer.
They're selling butter.
Yeah, and they were selling butter. But this is the kind of employer who's really invested in his people, wants to see them improve in the organization, and we need more of that. You know, a good example locally is Crystal Mountain. Crystal Mountain does that kind of thing with their employees. The Department of Human Services had a partnership with them for quite a long time and ended up losing funding to keep it going. But their purpose in having that relationship was they wanted to break down barriers that their employees had in order to either move up the system, to get to work. If they had a sick kid at home and they didn't have Plan B, help them develop a Plan B. Education and training will make a difference, but the difficulty is getting people to there.
Yeah, I think if we think about the ladder, the social class ladder, or the economic ladder today, the rungs are very close to each other at the very bottom. But in this two-tiered services economy, you can imagine that you can very quickly get to the top of the bottom tier, which doesn't really result in a heck of a lot of pay, generally speaking. But then to get to the next run is not just a quick reach up. It's going to involve a pretty substantial investment of time and commitment in education and training, and then potentially job experience in that space. And that's really, again, too, where I think a lot of people face a number of challenges. It's one thing to get a degree or a certificate or a credential, and those are important as far as the end goal is concerned. But getting those first jobs, there aren't as many of those better paying jobs. When we look at the post-recessionary recovery, the jobs that are coming back are in the lower tier. And some are coming back in the upper tier, but very few are coming back in the middle. This is like a ladder that has many rungs at the bottom and a few at the very top, but no real obvious way about how to get up in between.
Does this feel like a purposeful thing, or is this just kind of the fallout of the recession that happened? Maybe that question's not clear, and am I getting into conspiracy
Well, it sounds
theories?
like it's the change in the way that we buy. You know, our consumer culture has changed dramatically too, and the things that we actually consume, right? And probably sending our jobs and products being built in China and other places.
Well, that doesn't help. Outsourcing and offshoring doesn't help the American economy. It may help the global economy. It can help to create middle classes elsewhere, but I think one could argue very safely that that really impacts our own middle class, that we've essentially sort of outsourced the middle class in many respects. Part of it, too, I think, I wouldn't say any kind of conspiracy, not purposeful, but there is a change, I think, in the way that we think about what is rightful pay for those who are responsible for the steerage of the ship, so to speak. If we go back 60 years, those pay rates were much more akin to what we see in Europe today. CEO makes 50 to 100 to every one that the worker in that plant or company is making. But today we're up over 300 to 1. That's a pretty substantial difference in the distribution of wealth that's generated in the economy. And I would say behind that, too, is a change in the values, a change in the culture that's driving that. We tend to today very highly value those who are steering the ship, and we see the folks who are working down in the hull of the ship in a very different way, where we don't seem willing to value that work in the way that we used to. And
seems like they're getting kind of more and more angry about that too.
Yeah, and you know, we're not focusing
down there in the hull.
We're not focusing on poverty issues for the most part. You know, 52 years ago or more, we had this war on poverty under the Johnson administration. You guys wouldn't remember that, of course, but I remember Johnson, and it worked. It was really, really working. I mean, we had, you know, families who were living in absolute squalor in this country, and it really changed the dynamic. Keep in mind that we're talking for the most part about children, not about adults, but about children who grow up in this. So if you focus on something and you really put economics into it, and you really put a lot of thought into it, and you bring the country together and fight this war, we can really make a difference, but we're not doing that. And the other thing is that people in poverty are fighting so hard to get through the day. They don't have the ability to have a conversation like we're having. You know, they are fighting to pay their rent and fighting to pay their utilities and fighting to put food on the table. And what bothers me is that children are experiencing that. Children are watching their parents go without food. Children are watching their parents deal with having the electricity cut off and being evicted from their home. Children in the United States of America ought not to have to live that way.
Do you think part of the attitude stems from the culture and history of the United States? You know, when we talk about, and big in the news right now is, you know, our love of guns in this country compared to other countries, but goes back to who the kind of people were that kind of established this country and the attitude that was there. And it seems like poverty goes hand in hand with that, with the attitude of pull yourself up by, you know, in America we can pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, make our own way, you know, dig out of poverty to become that CEO who makes 300 times what the average worker does. So there is a belief that anybody can do that.
There is.
You know, that change from a caste system, from the kingdom and, you know, the peasants system where you couldn't pull yourself out of that. You were born into whatever. And in America, it's part of almost, it's the fabric of who we are in this culture to believe that so strongly, because we want to believe we could, right?
Absolutely.
So it almost seems like it's.
But you know what Dr. Phil would say about that?
I'm not sure I care what Dr. Phil says about anything, to be honest.
I do.
I'll listen. Okay.
And he would say, how's that working for you? And in the United States of America, it's not working. What we historically have done to people in poverty is we've imprisoned them. We have taken their children away. We have marked them as being deficit, deficient, criminal. We've done everything. So what if we took on a different attitude and started saying, we're going to support you, we're going to help you, we're going to provide opportunities for you to have education and training, we're going to connect you with people who have been successful, and we're going to watch you thrive. That would be really interesting if we could take that kind of approach.
So you're saying that we as a culture have perpetuated a cycle by taking people who are most in need of assistance due to whatever reasons have brought them to those circumstances in their life, and we make it worse. We separate families.
Yeah, and we've blamed them.
Yeah.
We've blamed them for their situation and not helped them.
So how do we change a whole culture in,
Well,
in their thinking in that way?
You know, I think we're doing that somewhat in this community.
Yeah. Here we are having this conversation right now, hitting out to many people sitting at home, watching on their internet, or sitting in their homes watching the television. Cultural change is slow. If we were to look at history, I think there's a good argument to be made that social change usually happens with legislative change first, and then slowly but surely cultural change begins to happen. If we were to wait, for example, I think, for the culture to have changed in order to eradicate slavery in this country, we potentially would still be there. Because if we look at what guides those longer term values about poverty, really haven't changed significantly in the United States. You're right, it's wrapped up in notions of the American dream, which is really a somewhat newer idea in American history. But that notion of who is the deserving poor versus the undeserving poor has really been with us since probably the 16 or 1700s, and Mary's right. We've tried all kinds of negative reinforcement ways, from literally scarlet letter types of approaches to criminalizing them to separating their families. And I think it's fair to say that that really doesn't do much except for stigmatize and shame people, and then make them even less likely to reach out for help when they could arguably use it.
You know, and another answer to your question, Brandon is a part of the Poverty Reduction Initiative in the community that really are trying to develop ways in which there can be this positive change with positive reinforcement and working on initiatives that work. You know, we know that things like Head Start work, but the capacity for all of the children that are eligible for Head Start, even in our own community, isn't there. We have this organization that we've established locally called HelpLink that matches people in poverty with people who have been successful. And there aren't enough of them, but the matches that we have made, you know, pretty good indication that it's working, that kind of a relationship is working in a very positive way.
Do you find that people are open to being helped by HelpLink, or is there a stigma attached to that? And I'm going back to what you were talking about our history of America. You were talking about how we value people or view people. I'll paraphrase what you were saying, this idea of this rugged self-reliance that America was in some ways founded on. And I think even if it's just something that's kind of subconscious and not conscious, we tend to value people who are rugged and self-reliant, don't need help from anybody. Yeah. And we literally attach more value to them. And I know a number of years ago when my wife and I, we had our second kid, and we were both working full-time, and neither one of those jobs were great jobs. And we qualified for milk and cheese, and I think some other things. And my wife and I struggled with that, like, this is just embarrassing to have to go ask for help. And then we kind of went, no, it's not. This is just life right now. Unfortunately, there's something there that offers a little bit of help for us. Do you find that that is a hurdle for people in need of help to overcome, or do they see HelpLink and go, yes, I'm walking with confidence?
Well, you know, HelpLink is kind of different, because what HelpLink really does also is that it connects people to resources within the community for things that they need. So people voluntarily come in because they have a need and they need to be connected to it, and so it's a way for them to get in the door. Once they get in the door, then all of these other options are available to them, like being connected with someone else. The notion of having people pull themselves up by their bootstraps is an anomaly. I mean, if you have education, like you and your wife probably had, if you have some family support, you have some resources, you probably can do it. But when you're talking about somebody in poverty whose all of their morals, advice, friendship, education, all comes from other people who are in poverty, there aren't the connections that need to be made to make that pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And keep in mind that I talked about how they're living in crisis, and so it's not like they have the time to sit back and think, okay, well, let's develop a plan, you know, to get out of this situation. They don't have those skills. They're fighting day by day to get through.
I think behind this too is we live in a very segregated society. We do. A couple of sociologists, Massey and Denton, back in the late 90s, they decided they were going to go back and take a look at the segregation issue across the country. And their hypothesis was that slowly over time, since Brown versus Board of Education, desegregation of schools, the country has been slowly getting more integrated. Completely denied that hypothesis. In fact, we're as segregated as we have ever been in the country. That's not just racially, but class-wise too. We live in different worlds, in the same spaces. Our relationships don't overlap, our neighborhoods don't overlap, our kids don't necessarily go to the same schools, we don't work in the same places. When you stop to think about what the cultural impacts are of that, I think it just makes it even easier for people to be othered in that process.
Right.
Where we can see people on the other side of the tracks, whether you're on the good side looking back or vice versa, is these are different kind of people, people that maybe you can't trust, people that you don't understand. And then what does that do for our ability as a society to engage in some kind of collective action for change? Instead, we tend to look out for ourselves and people who are like us. And when you leave, especially people who are vulnerable at the bottom end of the income distribution in the poorer places of this world, to work with others like them to try to create social change, no, the resources aren't there. All the different kinds of resources that Mary just mentioned, from network relationships, who you know. I mean, it's not what you know, right? It's who
Right.
you know. So, I mean, if
We have an
that's
owl in the
true,
room.
if that's true, then this segregation is going to be one of the main drivers, in my opinion. And until we begin to break this down, and to begin to accept that maybe mixed neighborhoods, for example, would be one way to begin to break down some of these things. I know that it wouldn't be easy. I know that there'd be a lot of people saying, not in my backyard.
Yeah.
But until these types of things happen, legislatively or culturally,
You
I
know,
think this is
even-
going to be difficult.
Even if we could get people in poverty to vote, I mean, it's one of the groups of people that nobody pays too much attention to, because for the most part they don't vote. They don't see themselves being heard by anybody.
Do you mean they don't
may
vote
have
out of a
covered.
sense of helplessness, or they don't have the time because they're working?
No,
or
I think it's out of a sense of it won't make any difference.
My vote doesn't count.
My vote doesn't
How
count.
often do you hear people say that? Yeah, it's just me, one vote.
I'm interested, I mean, as a sociologist, I'm sure you studied these groups in a historical context, and you mentioned not long ago the income difference from CEO to the worker.
Yeah.
And it seems like this pendulum swinging, because I'm thinking back to the time of Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Rockefeller, those guys. And from what I understand, their wealth was dramatically
Yeah.
more than it even is today compared to the average worker. So what was poverty like? How did we, I know that was the time when the unions started to come and be quite a force. But as far as just how we looked at poverty at that time and how we did at the time, because you said that's a factor, I'm just kind of curious, how has this ebbed and flowed over the years of the time that we've been around as a country, the United States?
Well, I think that if we were to sort of just take that bit of time and look at that, say from the Gilded Age till now, the 20th century, we could go back further, but some things remained the same. People in poverty were viewed similarly by the rest of society. Generally, kind of explaining the causes of poverty as a problem of individuals. That they had poor traits, that they made poor choices, or that they had a poor culture of some kind that was holding them back. That theme has remained throughout American history, really from the beginning, but certainly in the 20th century. But if we look at the Gilded Age and move forward to the new Gilded Age, which we're in now, there was a swing of the pendulum that really began with the war on poverty, that really in the kind of early 60s with the cultural revolutions that were taking place during that period of time and the social movements that were happening, there was a change. And it was largely initiated by government. There was this sense
Absolutely.
that we needed to take some kind of action to affirm the lower status of some people in the society and to try to take action to address that. That had an impact. The country swung more to the left. If anything, the country during that period of time was center left. And on the political spectrum, we know that generally the further left you go, the more there's going to be sympathies and empathies for the lower classes of society. There's any number of ways that we can measure that, but I think that people probably know that. The country is now to the right. We've also undergone an enormous amount of legislative changes from the Reagan era forward that have done things like deregulated industries and banking, kind of gotten the government out of the business of regulation, taking the teeth out of those regulations. What changed the Gilded Age was FDR and a major social change, including trades unionization. So a groundswell from the bottom and legislative change from the top. That some members of
And Social Security.
right, oh, absolutely. those changes really helped to make a difference. The legislative changes happened. You had a groundswell of demand from the bottom, and enough people at the top who saw the justification of that groundswell, who agreed with it and decided to use their power to make change. In that period of the 80s, where it sort of dismantled a lot of that work that came from FDR and came from the war on poverty in the Johnson administration, sort of undoing that, we've been seeing a gradual swing back to the other way toward a sort of gilded notion that of a trickle-down economic philosophy, of deregulation, of a freeing up of laws, and again, a swing to the right, which generally tends to favor this notion that people are where they are because of their hard work, because of their better choices, or if they're not, it's because of their laziness or because of their poor choices.
Let me give you a really good example of something locally. Of course, this happened all over the United States and not just in Great Traverse County, Michigan. But you know, we used to have this institution, this state hospital in this state. Back in the late 60s, with deinstitutionalization. Part of that came from some pressure on the war on poverty. Some of that came because of the development of Medicaid that came about, health insurance for poor people. But part of it was changes in the mental health law. But State Hospital, when I was a kid growing up here in Traverse City, there were 4,000 plus people living in the Traverse City State Hospital. I mean, it's probably hard for you guys to fathom because you haven't been around that long. The greatest majority of the people that were in that state hospital were not mentally ill. They were poor. They were poor. And there was no option for them because they had no money. There was not a poor farm anymore at that point in time. And it was the only option for old people who were getting a little bit, you know, touched or a little bit senile, and people would put them in the state hospital. You know, that's why I always said to people, if you ever decide to go back to an institutional setting, you know, I will fight it because it becomes something other than what it really was intended to be. Once they started deinstitutionalizing it, you know, that part of the poverty problem ended up, you know, being taken care of.
But now they're all in jail instead.
No, they're not.
Yeah, there's a big chunk of them in jail.
Well, people,
especially for the folks who may have been who had mental health issues.
That's correct.
Yes.
Not
Those
the poor
folks,
people,
yes.
though.
Yeah, I meant the mental health
right.
issues. I'm sorry.
But the
Yes, to be
greatest
clear.
majority of the people that were in the institution were not mentally ill. They were poor.
That's interesting. If I can come back to something you were saying, it sounds like, and I think you've said this kind of in the course of what we've been talking about as well, this is painting with a broad brush, but the left tends to see poverty as a systemic issue, and the right tends to see poverty as an individual issue.
Absolutely.
I think that's generally true.
And it seems like politically, I mean, this is nothing new, but the left and right just clash constantly. Do you see a way in which those two views can somehow work together? Because I think it's certainly true that systems have a huge impact. There's certainly at least some individual cases where it has something to do with individuals.
Sure.
Do you see a way in which those two theories can combine? Is there hope for this? Or does it just look like the more one side pushes, the more the other side's going to push
Well,
back?
I'd like to tackle that.
Please, go ahead.
To me, it's education. It's about most of the issues where there are clashes at the opposite ends of the poles. There is somewhere in there the truth and what's right. And if you can educate people, when I talk to groups of people, I say to them, the best thing that you can do to help people in poverty is that when your friend and your neighbor says to you, if they could only pull themselves up by their bootstraps, if they could just go get a job, tell them the truth. And if you tell them the truth about what's really happening with these people, that's the key. But you've got one side that's not really being truthful. My opinion.
I think that there are growing places of common interest across the political spectrum. And one of them is a revamping of the education system. I hear more often today, coming from both people I know who swing to the right and people I know who swing to the left, of moving away from the K-12 concept to a sort of cradle-to-career concept of education. Part of that is because this is driven partly by the fact that all of our state governments are, running on fumes. They don't have a lot of revenue. There's a lot of trouble there. we are learning that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of intervention, and that is a very penny-wise approach. People on the right are now saying early childhood intervention is something that we can agree to. We know that the studies are pretty much insurmountable. There's not really a question anymore. Everything from brain development to social development and everything else is impacted by those earliest years. We also know across the political spectrum there's greater and greater agreement that folks need more scaffolding to get into the labor market because of the changes that have happened as a result of the shift from manufacturing to services. Mm-hmm. I think that there's a real opportunity there. And part of it is, this might go back to some kind of love languages concept here, but we speak different languages to some extent, those on the left and those on the right. I think we need to try to capitalize upon the common language that exists there. And really, it's kind of about talking about these issues in ways that can appeal to people across political divides. Mm-hmm. Trying to learn each other's languages and what values guide those things, validating that, and trying to move forward from that. And right now, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of that.
I feel like, Mary, what you had touched on with the whole concept of when the mental hospital mm-hmm. was decommissioned, closed, they opened the doors and said, "Ha-ha, we're no longer available to you," kind of thing. But that a good portion of the folks who lived there were in poverty. I'm still mulling over that. I didn't realize that at all, and that's kind of, it's brought so many questions to mind in that, did everybody just kind of know that at the time, and that's just where you went? So the government didn't know? They thought they were all mentally ill and were willing to fund it? Was it a stigma? People did it out of sheer desperation? How did that come about, and then how? Yeah, it's a lot of questions are just like racing through my head.
That's
from
another
that one
whole
concept
show.
On a concept. Yeah.
I think basically the mental health laws were not what they are today. I mean, there has been a dramatic, in fact, that would be a good show.
Well, back
in itself.
then, you and our husbands could have just said, she's nuts, put her in there.
And I'm not so sure that isn't what happened. I'm not so sure that, I certainly think that happened with families, is that they didn't want to take care of their folks, and their folks ended up in the state hospital. But I think it was easier, the definition of dementia or whatever, there wasn't even the healthcare system today as there was back then. So I think it was easy to do, but clearly people did not realize what was happening. I don't think.
But it almost seems like it was an accidental social program for people in poverty.
It might.
Or are you saying it was a negative thing that people in poverty were living there?
It was a very negative thing.
Why?
Well, because is that what we thought was the option for people in poverty, is that we institutionalized them? I mean, we
thought it was a thing for people who were mentally ill. That's the disconnect that I'm missing. Was it by choice that they ended up there because they didn't have anywhere else to go?
Yes.
And so it was a place where you could have a food and bed, because it seems like that's what happens with jail these days. Almost you hear, and maybe this is a myth, but sometimes people commit petty crimes because they get a hot meal and a bed that night in jail. Or is that a complete myth?
Well, I think it's probably more of a myth today than it was a decade ago.
I think there's a lot more myth in that
than a decade ago. That's not very long, a decade, but.
Are you suggesting that with the state hospital, that the community tended to see people in extreme poverty as apparently not mentally healthy or stable enough to find work, and that was like what got them in there? Or you're saying family members put them in?
I think it was basically elderly people who were poor. They were not mentally ill. They were poor.
Right.
And families didn't want to take care of them or couldn't take care of them. Okay. It was both. And then so they ended up having them institutionalized. We used to have poor farms that were very similar to mental institutions, but they were poor farms, poor families lived on them. They had to work on the farm. But if you were elderly and you couldn't work, you couldn't live at the poor farm.
So at the risk of sounding like a heel, I think I'm missing something here. I guess in my mind, and I don't know what it was like to be there and to be institutionalized, but it feels like at least there was something, as opposed to nothing.
Yeah, but you got to look at it on the spectrum. I mean, we had a period of time in the early 1900s where we had the orphan trains. And so we thought, oh, these poor people, they can't take care of these children. We're going to take their children away. We're going to put them on a train. We're going to send them out to Wyoming, and they can work on the farm. Nobody did checks about these people that were living in Wyoming. They just wanted some labor, and so we're going to give these poor kids a place to live. Even if they mistreated them and abused them, we as a society thought, well, that's okay, because it's better than living with their own family in poverty.
Right.
So I think the comparison I'm making is that this is just another example of where we have always historically seemed to make the wrong decision relative to people in poverty, and the bottom line is it never worked. Why don't we try something else? Why don't we try something innovative?
It just occurred to me, the disconnect. So I understand that the government wasn't making this decision, particularly to the mental hospital.
I think they probably were. It was run by the government.
Okay, but you said they didn't know that was, that people in poverty were actually they thought that they were running an institute for
the mentally ill. You got to help me out here, but
I think that it's a values difference. I mean, to some extent, we're sitting from the privilege of the world today, looking back, and to some extent, we're making a giant leap to imagine what the value systems were like, or what it would be like to be in a situation where a choice like that would seem like a positive one. The thing is that if we go back into that period of time, the view of people in poverty was so stigmatized that they were seen as one-off in many respects from the rest of society, that there was something peculiar.
Their deficit.
There was it was a deficit model of understanding. So if you think about the deficit model as a way of explaining poverty, which was prevalent and still is very prevalent today, but was very prevalent and even more so in times past, it's not a huge leap in some circumstances to wonder if institutionalization or orphanages would be a way to improve the situation, even though it was, now we can look back and say this was a very poor kind of decision making based on a lot of summary judgments that were prevalent in the culture at the time. That these folks were sort of one-off and therefore could be subject to a different kind of treatment in order to help them in a way that today would be considered unthinkable.
So when you say you were disappointed in the way culture handled it, that the families ended up having to put their family members there. And I was thinking you were saying we, in terms of that the government kind of looked the other way and knew this was happening. So I was misunderstanding, I think.
Well, right.
I have a different question. You mentioned right at the beginning that the numbers of people in poverty is at an all-time high. Is the increase in poverty part of a cycle of poverty where people who are born into poverty are replicating that? Or are people coming from non-poverty backgrounds and now becoming impoverished?
That is a really good question. One would like to believe, I think sometimes, that it is this generational thing. And it was at one time. Back when there was the program called the Aid-Dependent Children Program, you saw a lot of generational poverty. Generation after generation after generation of people receiving. But that's when it was an entitlement program. It's not an entitlement program anymore. You know, very clear temporary assistance to families that are needed. And it is no longer really generational as much as it is situational. Okay. Because, you know, there's rules about how long you can get help, typically 5 years. And we're just not seeing it. I would say when I was the director in Grand Traverse County, we probably had 0 families at that point in time that were getting any kind of assistance for over 5 years. So there wasn't this long generational thing. The economic changes where people were losing jobs, people who had 401ks, people who had savings, people who had great paying jobs, those are the people that about 8 years ago we started seeing walking through the door.
I wish that there was some way. I don't know the numbers of the distribution of folks who are in poverty today who are generationally poor versus situationally poor, but certainly the situational poverty is on the rise. the greatest rise among people in poverty is among the working poor. Mm-hmm. When we break down other kinds of statistics, half of us will fall into poverty at some point in our adult life. 2/3 of us will fall to an economic insecurity level that would make us, like you were talking about, eligible for certain kinds of social supports. That must mean that there's a great deal of diversity, really, of people who are falling in and out of poverty. But generational poverty, like generational wealth, has dynamics to it that are interesting and important. How we break those cycles, I think, goes back to this notion of really cultural change and maybe legislative change. I think that what we need to be thinking about is how can we sort of raise the floor, really, to some degree. Right now, arguably, I would say that we don't have much of a safety net. Certainly, we don't have a floor that people can't fall beneath. And I think that that's something that we need to change. And that's something that requires legislative change, ultimately. But the cycle of poverty is real in some places where the economics are broken down. Rural areas, urban areas are places where we see more of that generational cycle of poverty take place. Mm-hmm. We also see generations of wealth in those same places as well. For the same drivers that cause some to be able to maintain wealth and power are the same drivers that maintain powerlessness and lack of income and wealth at the opposite end. One of the big things around here, I think, that perpetuates generational poverty is a spatial mismatch between the kinds of skills and the location of where the jobs are and the kinds of jobs that are available in our community.
Can you give some examples?
Yeah, absolutely. It's back to that service sector economy thing. We don't have many ways where folks can make it very far into the middle class from a career ladder perspective in our area. The other thing is that in rural communities, too, we tend to have folks who are less educated. That doesn't create a workforce if you're an employer who has kind of industrial jobs that do provide more middle-class wages, or those knowledge economy jobs that we were talking about at the beginning of the show. Rural areas where the education is less, that's not going to be a very appealing workforce to come and move your business to. That is a very real issue. We have to develop the skill basis, I think, in our community to become a more attractive workforce for business today. At the same time, admitting and acknowledging the fact that for many people, college seems like planets away from where they are. And finding ways to pave that way for them that's more realistic.
I think one other thing that's really important, and it goes back to my care and concern for the children. You know, we've got to change the paradigm for the kids. And one of the things that was lost in the state of Michigan are prevention dollars. You know, pretty much they went away. And I think that we need to invest, like Brandon actually said earlier, need to invest in early childhood development, which is investing in prevention programs, invest in programs like Head Start, invest in initiatives that we have seen across the country that work in working with children, and in having them have as a part of their belief system, I am going to go to college, I am going to get an education, and I am going to live a better life than what my family did, and have some real incentives. You know, for the most part, you talk to a kid that's grown up in poverty, and you try to get them to dream. They don't even know how to dream out loud, to be able to say, well, what I really want to do in my life, or what I really want to be, that there is no frame of reference for them. And we need to create that for these kids.
There's a national organization known as Strive Together that's looking at this cradle to college framework. And I think it really is important.
Yeah.
When we look at the socialization of young people who are growing up in poverty versus those, you know, kind of in the higher classes, it's a matter of who you know, again. One thing we know is that students coming into kindergarten from the lower classes have a more limited vocabulary. A lot of the things that, for me, growing up in the middle class, I gained college knowledge just sort of by the osmosis of being socialized in a family where college education was not a world away from where I was. Mm-hmm. I saw the real fruits and rewards. And what Strive Together is trying to do is really to teach explicitly to people across the class system to talk about college. This is what happens there. Demystify it. make it closer. Bring authentic voices of people who've gone to college, who've experienced the benefits. Bring them back to those communities where generational poverty exists and to talk about these things.
I have to throw in a part here because one of the things that I've seen over the years, and anecdotal evidence here, but it feels to me like we need to have more technical schools because college, an example, just Friday night I met 3 young college students in a situation I was in, and the one gal said to me that she was going to study philosophy, which I thought was interesting and fantastic because that's my hobby, and that she was going to get a master's degree in that, and she said these words. She said, well, I know pretty much everyone who goes to college doesn't end up working in the field that they studied in college. So I figured I might as well just study something that I really enjoy, and who knows what I'll end up actually doing. Okay. And there was a lot of truth in that, I think, and what we're seeing. And if we really invested more in technical programs, right, it seems like that is the middle class that we're talking about here. Plumbers, contractors in the building fields, not just manufacturing, but those kinds of trades, opposed to.
But it isn't necessarily going into that trade because you can do that now. You're going to get paid half as much as what your previous person ended up getting paid in that job. There are so many of those jobs that have dropped from the middle class down into lower wages.
Yeah. I think that's right. I mean,
how do we bring those wages back up then? There's value to a technical. I mean, you have to have a license to be a plumber. You have to have I can't just hire somebody off the street to do my plumbing.
I mean, this goes back to some of those values questions. It's unpopular to say, but businesses individually, the economy at large, generates X amount of wealth from it. That distribution and how that wealth gets distributed among all the people who contribute to the economy is at the center of everything that we're talking about. So as long as we give permission, I think, to owners, to managers, that the value of their work is astronomically more important than the work of the people who are actually doing the stuff, then this is all a lot of these questions are moot, I'm afraid. The other thing that I'm concerned about is that, yes, it's true, we need to create technical expertise. But one of the things that's really tough is that we're, in teaching in college, this is something I'm sensitive to, how do we train a young and up-and-coming workforce for an economy that we can't even predict what it's going to look like in 5 years from now?
Yeah.
I'm not sure that training is so much the answer for the lot of those folks. I think it's probably more like critical thinking, transferable skills that can be chameleon-like to shift with the economy in some meaningful way. If we were to just sort of train people to go out, for one, there's an assumption that there's a dearth of jobs just waiting for them. That's not really the case. We could be training up a lot of folks, as we've done with the traditional college system, to prepare for jobs where there are no jobs. And so we have people with master's degrees working as servers and bartenders all over this community. We've met them, unfortunately, by the droves. Until we decide that we're going to keep some of those robust middle-class jobs in our area, in our country, I think that we face a real challenge. And that's going to require, both from the bottom, a clamor for those kinds of jobs. People in the streets, could be anything from the old days of unionizing or really just getting out there and saying, no, we need middle-class jobs here now. Until that happens and the folks at the top begin to give some credence to that, I think we're in a tough spot. There has to be a coming together of those folks who've been displaced by the economy and those folks who own and manage it to try to find a more workable situation. Going back to the sustainability question, I don't think we want to go back to the 30s where we had bomb-going riots of unionization as a way to be able to get the attention of folks at the top. We don't want to go in that direction. I think instead we have to try to find a way that we can work together. And I see that cradle-to-career concept as a way to at least be able to move forward across the political spectrum to find the common ground and to be able to do that.
He pretty much encapsulated the problem.
Absolutely.
We're out of time, but there's a moment for you to add and have the last word.
Wow, I didn't expect to have the last word.
First word and last word today.
That's right.
You know, I guess I would just like to emphasize that these are people in our community who are our neighbors, our friends, our relatives. They're struggling. Get the facts, get the information, become informed, and when somebody says to you, you know, these people, they don't work and they don't take care of their kids and they're no good, that you can stand up and say, that's not the facts. These are the facts about people living in our community.
That's an excellent last word.
Thanks.
We'll leave it at that, and thank you so much for watching our program here in Focus. You can check us out online as well after we've aired.